Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today, in honor of Easter, we are going to be bringing something back from the dead. We will be bringing back debunking the Modal Ontological Argument 6 ways from Sunday. Happy Easter. Why? Because the Modal Ontological Argument has come back from the dead. I thought after giving 66 objections to this argument that it was dead and gone for good. But another YouTuber has brought this back up and has offered a response to one of my videos. Honestly, I'm a little flattered. It's the first response video I've gotten, or at least the first one that I've seen, so that's pretty cool for me. But in this video, I'm going to be offering, 6 times 2, 12 objections to the response that's offered there. The response is offered by Animating Rebel, and it's refuting Carneades.org. Modal Ontological Argument does not beg the question. So it's a response to my Friday video in the Debunking the Modal Ontological Argument 6 Ways from Sunday, where I talked about how the Modal Ontological Argument does in fact beg the question, back and forth, back and forth. Animating Rebel seems like a very nice person. I have nothing against him personally, but I'm going to refute a lot of his arguments here. I think there are some of his points that get to a deeper point and are actually a pretty interesting debate, and some points that are just incorrect and can fairly easily be glossed over. So let's take a look. First point he's going to make is saying that if this is what the Modal Ontological Argument was saying, then it would beg the question that if it's possible that it's necessary that A, it's equivalent to it's necessary that A. This is one of those points that I'm a little concerned by. If you've been following my 100 Days of Logic series, you will know that this is known as 5, or S5. This is the main principle of System 5. I'm concerned because, 1, Plantinga himself claims that the Modal Ontological Argument in fact relies on this claim. And that has nothing to do with it begging the question or not. There is a lot of debate around S5 and whether or not it is an intuitive principle or if it's something we want in our system. However, it doesn't really have much to do with it begging the question. Those are two logically very different statements. It's possible that it's necessary that A, and it's necessary that A. They're different statements, and we're not really talking about whether or not something's begging the question here. So, objection number 1, this is axiom S5, and it is an integral part of the Modal Ontological Argument. So it is something that the Modal Ontological Argument has to say in order to work. And objection number 2, but that doesn't really go to the point of begging the question or not. Because S5, while it's not intuitive, as I show in my video on modal logic, isn't something that causes an argument to beg the question. So, with that aside, it's a little bit of a concerning statement. Now, one of the things that I think Animating Rebel does do good to push on me around is the difference between de dicto and de re. It's something that I definitely glossed over in my original video responding to Inspiring Philosophy, and I want to dig a little deeper into here. Right now, I have a series out on the difference between de dicto and de re. There's not only one distinction. There is the semantically de re de dicto distinction, there's the syntactically de re de dicto distinction, and there is the modally de re de dicto distinction. The modally distinction goes as follows, or the modal distinction is as follows. A de dicto statement of the statement goes, it is possible that the shortest spy is not in fact a spy. What we're doing here is we're parsing the difference between the two different interpretations of it's possible that the shortest spy is not a spy. The de dicto interpretation is talking about any Tom, Dick, or Harry. It's talking about whatever the concept of shortest spyness. It's talking about the shortest spy, even in a world where spies don't exist. And it's going to be false, because the shortest spy, whatever shortest spy means, has to be a spy, because included in that concept is spyness. Included in that statement, de dicto statement, is spyness. So it's false. Whatever is the shortest spy, whatever fulfills that definite description, has to be a spy. The de re interpretation, on the other hand, is talking about the person who is in fact the shortest spy is such that they might not have been a spy. In this case, we are talking about the specific person in the actual world who just happens to be the shortest spy. I called him a guy named Ray. Helps me remember de re de dicto. That guy named Ray, of him In some other possible world, is he doing something else? In some possible world, is he a plumber? In some possible world, is he a lawyer? In some possible world, is he a homeless person? If that is the case, as it is, this is going to be a true statement. So, to clarify, De Re is talking about a specific person who must exist for the statement to be true. Spies have to exist for the De Re version to be true. And specifically, one person that's picked out by the statement, the shortest spy, has to exist. If we're talking about if it's possible that that person was not a spy, it's going to be true. If we're talking the de dicto version, where we're just talking about the statement of the statement shortest spy. Is it possible that shortest spy could have been not a spy? Any Tom, Dick, or Harry that happens to be a spy could not have been a spy? No, of course not. It's whichever spy in whichever possible world is the shortest spy. Could not have been a spy. Of course not, because that's picking out whoever fulfills shortest spyness. It might be Tom in another world. And in that world, he couldn't be a lawyer because he does fulfill shortest spyness. It could be Dick in another world. And in that world, he couldn't fulfill plumberness because he has to be shortest spyness. It's talking about within that world. It's de dicto, different from de re. Now, our statement in the modal ontological argument is talking about something very different. It talks about necessity instead of possibility, and it's talking about maximal greatness and all that stuff. So let's slowly make our way there. First, we're going to switch this over to necessary instead of possible. The de dicto version would be, it is necessary that the shortest spy is, in fact, a spy. This, of course, is going to be the switch around of our last argument. It's going to be true, and once again, spies need not exist, because we're talking about the truth of the statement, not the truth about something physically in the actual world. Generally, and statements, not about the actual world. De Re is talking about that specific person, Re, who is in fact the shortest spy, could not have been anything other than a spy. This one's going to be false. Existence is required of Re, because we have to be talking about some Re, and of Re, he could have been a plumber, he could have been a lawyer, so it's going to be false. It's not that he could not have been anything other than a spy. Okay, we've moved to necessity. Now let's talk about maximal greatness and God and all that good stuff. So, de dicto, it is necessary that the being that is maximally great, all good, necessary, etc., is in fact necessary. This is any God, Yahweh, Allah. It's true, and existence is not required. Here is where I think Animating Rebel does a good job to put pressure, is to say that the modal ontological argument is not talking about de dicto. It's not making this claim, because this claim is basically kind of a reduction to the argument from definition. And it's not convincing at all. It is definitely question-begging, and it's not convincing to anyone, even in the slightest. Because all it's saying is something that is by definition necessary is necessary. The de re claim, on the other hand, is something a little bit different. The being who is in fact the maximally great being is such that it could not have been anything other than a maximally great being. The being in the actual world that is a maximally great being is a maximally great being in all possible worlds. It isn't a somewhat great being in another world. In all possible worlds, that maximally great being, that being that is maximally great here in the actual world, is the same type of being in all possible worlds. This is talking about a specific being, God. It can be false. It is possible for this to be false. If God was a semi-great being in another world, then it would in fact be false. And it assumes the existence of God. If in fact God did not exist in the actual world, then this statement wouldn't be true. You need existence for this to follow. Here's the worrisome point with de re de dicto. For de dicto, you don't need to assume existence. However, it's not going to be convincing. For de re, you need to assume existence. Here's the big problem. If we assume existence, we've given up the ghost. We've given up the race. We've given it up because all we're trying to prove is that God exists. So if our first premise assumes that God exists, then we've just straight up begged the question. So, objection number 3. If the being is de dicto necessary, then this argument reduces to the argument from definition. I'm pretty sure that's not what Inspiring Philosophy and Animating Rebel are saying. And I think that's the point they're making, that is going to be a straw man. The problem is the de re interpretation is not going to allow for an existent God either, because it's going to have to assume God's existence, because that's what de re does. De dicto, you can get away with not assuming God's existence, but you're only talking about statements, not things that exist. De re assumes existence, and if you're presupposing existence, you're going to beg the question. It's just the way begging the question works. Okay, that was the kind of deeper piece. I'm going to respond to a couple other points that Animating Rebel makes in the video now. So, God would exist as a maximally great being, necessity included, in some possible world, but as a maximally excellent being, necessity excluded, in all possible worlds. This is really worrying to me because it doesn't seem to understand the concept of necessity. Necessity is simply equivalent to existing in all possible worlds. Therefore, it's nonsense to say that something is necessary in only one possible world. That just doesn't make sense. It makes no sense to say that something exists in all possible worlds in one particular world. If you are in one world, you can't exist in all possible worlds. If you are identical to something that in fact exists in all possible worlds, that's saying something. That's just saying that all things are maximally great. If there's a maximally great being that exists in all possible worlds, and then there's a different thing that's a maximally excellent being, it's different because it doesn't have necessity that exists in some other possible world, then they're not the same thing. We're not referencing the same thing. So that maximally great being isn't actually necessary because one of its components, one of its compatriots, isn't the same as it. It's confusing, and it's not understanding the definition of necessity. If it's a maximally great being, what you're saying and what the modal ontological argument is saying is just that that maximally great being exists in all possible worlds as a maximally great being. Now, we get back to the circular reasoning is okay if it's used to inform, not persuade. We can go back and forth all day on this. Here's all I'm going to say. Is it valid? Yes. Sure. So is P, therefore P. Is it informative? Sure. Fine. So is not P, therefore P. Or any other kind of rule of logic that explains two equivalent things. Is it persuasive to anyone that does not already accept the conclusion of the argument? Not in the slightest. Which is why the modal ontological argument is not convincing and begs the question. Let's dig into this a little bit deeper. So, we say that people already accept premise 1. The argument simply shows this is equivalent to the conclusion. The problem is, what it seems to me is not that people already accept premise 1, but that people already deny the conclusion. And that all the argument does is show them that they also deny premise 1. So, someone that doesn't have the belief that a necessary God exists or even that a God exists in the actual world, is simply going to be convinced by this argument that they also lack the belief that it's possible that a necessary God exists. If you already believe that God doesn't exist, all this is doing is simply showing you that you also believe that a maximally great being isn't possible. If that's all we're doing with the argument, it can be run either way. And if all we're showing is that premise 1 and the denial of the conclusion are things that don't agree with each other, that don't match up, then sure, it just means that you can only have one in your ontology. You pick one. If the atheist picks the conclusion, there's nothing the proponent of the modal ontological argument can do other than provide support for premise 1, which we're still waiting for. Now, next he's going to talk about my explanation of question begging as just providing definitions. Once again, this is going to be something that's pretty concerning. Why? Because he says offering definitions constitutes adding new information. However, textbook definition of begging the question. The second form of petitio principii, that's begging the question, occurs when the conclusion of an argument merely restates the possibly false premise in a slightly different language. P.J. Hurley, Logic, page 151. That's a logic textbook, by the way. The point here is, Hurley then goes on to give examples nearly identical to the examples offered by Animating Rebel, showing that all begging the question is, in this case, is to restate the statement with synonyms, with words that mean the same thing. That is an example of begging the question, even if amongst the argument you define those words and explain what they are. This is just patently incorrect. You have in fact offered a textbook definition of what begging the question is and claim that it's equivalent to your argument. So you're just claiming that your argument begs the question. Very, very concerned and very, very worried. The next point he's going to make is that the way we can turn an argument that begs the question into an argument that doesn't is simply by offering some more definitions. Well, this is once again a little worrying, so let's try it with my kind of mock argument. God exists if and only if it is not the case that either it is the case that God exists or God does not exist. Therefore, God exists. He says the problem with this is I haven't offered any definitions. I haven't explained anything. If I did, then it wouldn't beg the question. So, I'll offer some explanations. Either it is the case that God exists, or it's not the case that God exists. Law of the excluded middle. If it is not the case that it is not the case that God exists, then it is the case that God exists. It's just the definition of double negation. Therefore, God exists. It doesn't seem like I've done anything really to improve this argument. Sure, I've explained what I mean by certain things in the first premise, but the argument is no more convincing, perhaps more informative, but I don't have any more reasons to really accept the conclusion, and the argument is definitely no less question-begging, because the first premise is still equivalent to the conclusion. Objection 8. Simply adding definitions does not absolve the argument from the charge of begging the question. In fact, redefining things or just taking synonyms and replacing them in the conclusion is all that begging the question means. He also says that saying it's not the case is nonsense. I'm really concerned. What logic are double negations not allowed? In fact, that's a very important part of all logic. I hope that was a mistake and you didn't really mean that. Multiple negations appear all the time in logic. Check out my videos on the 100 Days of Logic. They're an example of something being logically equivalent to something else, as the first premise of the Modal Ontological Argument claims to be equivalent to the conclusion. Objection number 9. Now, he's going to say that most people already believe premise 1, so it requires no support. Wow. First off, argumentum ad populum is a logical fallacy. If you don't know what that is, check out my series on fallacy, February, from a couple months ago. But basically, argumentum ad populum is saying that, well, a lot of people believe it, therefore it's true. Nope, doesn't work. It's a logical fallacy. And here's the more important point, and this is a fallacy of equivocation. While many people may believe that a contingent God is possible, this argument is talking about a lack of belief in a necessary God and showing that that's equivalent to a lack of belief in an actual God. So, if people lack belief in the actual God, that just shows that they lack belief in a necessary God. But it doesn't say anything about whether they can believe in a contingent God. Remember, a contingent God is a God that exists only in some possible world, not all possible worlds or not no possible worlds. It's not saying that God is impossible. It's saying that God exists, sure, but only in one possible world. Claiming that something is true simply because most people accept it is the definition of the logical fallacy argumentum ad populum. Objection number 10. Objection 11, you're equivocating a common belief that a contingent God is possible, that God exists in some possible world, with a less common one, that a necessary God, a God that exists in all possible worlds, is in some way possible. There's a difference between those two things, and it's one of the biggest problems with the modal ontological argument. Equivocating common belief with less common belief. Now, if you don't think that God is possible, then the only other option is that God is possibly impossible. Incorrect. As I just said, if you don't think a necessary God is possible, you might think that a contingent one is. So remember how you talked about a maximally excellent being, one that has all of God's properties but doesn't have necessity? That maximally excellent being is what people are talking about when they're talking about saying a God is possible. And they're saying that maximally excellent being, sure, maybe it exists in some possible world, but I don't think it exists in the actual world, or I don't know if it exists in the actual world. Therefore, it doesn't seem to me that it's necessary, or at least it doesn't seem to me there's any reason to believe that it is necessary. There are two statements contained in the first premise, that the general formulation of the modal ontological argument explains, and that the formulation offered by inspiring philosophy kind of hides. One, that God is not contingent, and two, that God is possible. You're allowed to deny the former without denying the latter. People who think that a maximally excellent being exists in maybe one and only one, or some but not all, possible worlds, deny the former, saying that God is not contingent, but affirm the latter. They say, sure, God's possible, but he's not contingent. He, in fact, is contingent. That's objection number 12. Finally, he's going to bring up the modal perfection argument. He doesn't really offer any objections to my points on that, so I'm not going to get into it too much. All I'm going to say is you should check out my series of logic problems on the 100 Days of Logic, because the final expert problem is on your own proving the modal perfection argument. Because while I object to the premises offered for the modal perfection argument, it seems to me the argument is valid. So you should be able to, using the lovely rules of logic we have learned, prove it on your own. That was a response to the resurrection of the modal ontological argument. Happy Easter, everybody. Enjoy some eggs, chocolate, or don't. Maybe watch some zombie movies. I don't know. Stay skeptical, everybody.